So in this video, I want to give my 2 cents on why I feel like Shoto Todorki would have been a way better main character than Izuku Midoriya. Now let me keep this honest. I don't feel like Midoriya is the worst main character there ever was, but I do feel like he had a lot of potential that was never truly fleshed out in the series. And ironically, I feel like Shoto was actually pretty well fleshed out. Now this video is my personal opinion, and if you don't agree, that's totally understandable. But I've actually gone ahead and broken this down into 5 parts that I believe make an ideal character. Flaws, backstory, relatability, goals, and evolution. I'm sure there are other aspects as well, but for me, when all those things are present, I feel like we have a very fleshed out character or a well-written protagonist. So in order for me to show my point, I'm going to be comparing these things in both Todoroki and Midoriya. So let's start off with backstory. Now Deku is born to a single mom. The show never really reveals who Deku's father is, and it's never expounded on. Deku's mother has a basic quirk, but through tragic destiny, Deku is born without a quirk. Now this backstory sets him up to be an amazing character because his dream is to become the greatest hero, similar to his idol All Might. While All Might possesses one of the most powerful quirks in the world, Deku possesses none. This alone creates an interesting narrative for a hero. I mean, Deku's backstory is left intentionally blank because I think he represents an everyman character. He's bland enough so that he can be someone that anybody can relate to, but he doesn't have much of a real story, and this feels a little bit vanilla. Now let's compare this to Todoroki. If you've watched My Hero Academia, you should be aware, but for those of you who are maybe new to the show, Shoto is the 4th child of the world's strongest hero. His father intentionally had him in a quirk marriage where 2 people with ideal powers have kids together to produce a hybrid child with amazing powers. Shoto's father Endeavor had an obsession with becoming the strongest, but realizing his limitations, he decides to have a child that can overcome what he was not able to do. This leads him to marry his wife solely to have a genetically advanced kid. He ends up mistreating his family, he doesn't spend enough time caring for them, and his obsession over Shoto once it becomes apparent that he can achieve his dreams pushes him away from all of his siblings. This leads to the supposed death of his older brother and drives Shoto's mother to insanity, to the point where she accidentally scars her own son. When you contrast Shoto's backstory to Deku's, there's so much more tragedy in Shoto's story. It's not that I believe that main characters have to suffer, but it does tend to be a better story where you can see hardships of a character. Shoto isn't an underprivileged kid. In fact, being the son of the world's #2 hero, he lives a very well-off life, but he's been through a lot psychologically. Even though his story is more specific than Deku, it hits more emotional value for people who can relate to the pressure of having to live up to your father or having to live up to the household. There are so many different elements to Shoto's backstory that truly make it far more interesting. Because he isn't the main character, the writer isn't afraid to add more spice. And I think that spice is what makes Shoto's backstory far more interesting than Midoriya's. Now let's touch on flaws. Deku's initial flaw in My Hero Academia is that he was born quirkless. In a society filled with superpowers, Deku is born without. Even though his biggest wish is to be the greatest hero as his idol All Might, having no superpowers actually sets up a big challenge for our hero, as All Might is the greatest because of his overwhelming power. Eventually Deku is gifted power from his idol, and thus his main flaw is pretty much gone from the start of the series. My issue with Deku's quirklessness is that it's written out way too early in the story. Deku's biggest obstacle was overcome fairly early on in the show. He does eventually run into other obstacles as he is unable to control his extremely overpowered quirk, but I don't think that this obstacle hits as hard as the idea of not having powers at all. My Hero Academia misses the mark by giving Deku powers far too early in the series. Basically, Deku never truly has to deal with his quirklessness during the actual show. Any hardship he faces from being quirkless was dealt with before the start of the series, and thus it's hard to consider it a real flaw. After receiving his powers, he struggles to make use of them because his body was not trained to handle so much power. As a result, he damages himself whenever he uses his power, but even that was pretty short-lived. As far as I've seen, Deku never has to live with any long-term problems after damaging his body from using his overpowered quirk. At first, every time I saw him break his arms and his legs, I felt something. It feels like it means something, but over time, I noticed that no matter how many times he breaks his arms or his legs or overexerts himself, he always goes back to normal. And thus, there was never any real danger. The show says that he will be in trouble, but he never truly experiences any major problems from using his quirk the way he does. Outside of being quirkless and not being able to use his powerful quirk properly, Deku's main flaw is that he cares too much for others, and I guess his occasional insecurity. My thing is, it's hard to say or even highlight these things as flaws. As an anime watcher, I'm generally tired of protagonists whose main issue is that they care too much. While we'd like to call it a flaw, it just seems pretentious. I do think it's a good idea to have kind characters, but always having them be so kind feels unrealistic. Characters will straight up murder people and Deku will be trying to forgive them, and frankly, I hate this. Maybe there was a time that this made sense, but in this day and age, I think characters need to have more depth in their personality. Aside from Deku having no major flaws, by the end of the series, he goes from quirkless to having around 7 different quirks. Now, can you imagine a scenario where what made our character interesting in the first place was that he goes from 0 to having 7? I mean, what was the point of making him quirkless in the first place, only to end up giving him a bunch? Now let's compare this to Shoto. In contrast to Deku, Shoto is born with 2 quirks, which makes him exceptional from the start of the show. But here's what makes him interesting. Shoto's flaws were never about his quirk or his weakness in strength. Shoto's flaws were more rooted in his past. He blames his father for driving his mother insane and causing the scar that he wears on his face, a constant reminder of the trauma that he's endured. He also refuses to use his fire power because it comes from his dad, so he only uses his eyesight, even though based on his body composition, he needs to use both to maximize his potential. Even though Shoto's limits are self-imposed, I still feel stronger conviction. We can understand why Shoto won't use his dad's powers because he hates his dad, and we see enough of his dad being a monster to understand. This self-imposed flaw is one of the most things that I respect because I can acknowledge his trauma. Another flaw that Shoto has is that he originally found it hard to work alongside others, and I feel like this is beautifully done in the series. We can see why Shoto doesn't work well with others because that's how he was raised. What I truly love about Shoto is that he doesn't suddenly get over his character flaws. These are things that he gradually has to come to terms with over the entire series. He doesn't suddenly forgive his father, it literally takes him the entire series. The show introduces flaws for Shoto, and we as the audience have to watch slowly as he overcomes them. Not by some random power up, but through challenges and growth. So now that we have backstory and flaws, let's touch on relatability. So let's keep it real. I know I'm discussing a fictional piece of work, and I also know that these are superpowered characters, so I don't expect them to be perfectly grounded in reality. But when I judge a character's relatability, I like to emphasize emotions, because whether fact or fiction, we all feel emotions. Honestly, we never truly experience much from Deku. He self-loathes, which is a typical shonen protagonist thing, but I've hardly ever seen this guy be upset at anyone or anything. He's constantly trying to save bad guys, and he doesn't seem to have much self-worth or self-respect. Even towards the end of the series, he never truly values himself or sees himself as someone worthy of praise. On the other hand, outside of his emotions, Deku still remains pretty unrelatable. His major flaws is overcome super early in the show, he's overpowered, super sensitive, and just a generally nice guy. I really wish the show could have shown Deku as a more three-dimensional character. Aside from sadness and kindness, we never really experience anything else from Deku. Now let's contrast that with Shoto. To be totally fair, Shoto is also a pretty bland character when it comes to emotions. He doesn't talk much and comes off as shy and reclusive. However, this fits perfectly with his backstory. Shoto is a sheltered kid who was told by his dad to work at all times, so it makes sense that he doesn't talk much. He also hates his dad and struggles with those emotions. Later in the series, as the relationship progresses, he also feels conflict. On one hand, he hates his dad, but he also doesn't want to see him get hurt. How much more relatable does that get? I'm sure many people have similar relationships, even if it's not with their dad, but with someone dear to them who they both care for and hate at the same time. Shoto, while not being the most expressive emotionally, still comes off as a character who expresses a full range of emotions. Now let's combine goals and evolution into one section. By evolution, I simply mean how the character has progressed from the start of the series to the end. At the start of the series, Deku's goal is to become the world's greatest hero, a big goal for a child who is born without a quirk. Through his bravery and persistence, he eventually is gifted one of the most powerful quirks in the entire series. By the end of the show, to be honest, I don't see Deku as having changed much. I will highlight that his perspectives on villains help to shed some light. He realizes that morality has grey areas and that it's good to look at what creates villains and not just the problems themselves. But to be fair, Deku has always been a kind person that was willing to give people a chance. If his strong sense of justice had caused him to treat villains harshly, then this perspective would have more of an impact. Overall, Deku being more considerate and understanding of villains is really no major difference from Deku at the start of the series to the end of the series. Todoroki, on the other hand, has the goal of becoming the strongest without acknowledging the powers he inherited from his father. If you compare that to the end of the series, where Shoto decides that he wants to accept both sides of himself and create a path, we see where he truly stops living in his father's shadow and becomes a man. It's clear that Shoto has evolved more as a character. And if you guys think I was done, I have more points. So Shoto and his father's relationship is much more relatable and interesting to watch than Deku and All Might's. All Might to me is just a better version of Deku, and I mean this in a very bland way. All Might suffers from the similar flaw of being too perfect. His only issue is now that he's damaged and can no longer be Mr. Perfect. Watching Endeavor on screen has honestly been one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. Even down to the fights, Endeavor struggles in almost every battle. Whenever this guy is on screen, it's like you can't tell if he's going to win or not. It's these high stakes scenarios that make me want to cheer for him. He struggles with being second best, a fight he's had to fight for so long. His intentions are good, he truly wants to be a hero, but in trying to be a hero, he's acted more like a villain. This beautiful grey area is what makes a good character. How far can you go to do the right thing? Is the intent better than the means? These are philosophical questions and the aspects that make a really interesting story. We want redemption. We want introspection. It's okay to mess up and then to figure out how to make it better. He's apologetic for the way he treated his family, but wishing it away won't work. His horrible actions have not only destroyed his family, but ironically created one of the most powerful villains in the series. Think about it. A character trying to create the most powerful hero ends up creating one of the most powerful villains, who then has to be defeated by his son. It's almost poetic. Everything about the Todoroki family genuinely lends to a better and more interesting story. Their dynamic amongst themselves, their redemption, and their dysfunction. I know it's easy to write a nice guy character, but honestly, Shoto was a hero that we deserved. If you enjoyed this video, the YouTube algorithm says you're gonna love this video right here.